We have a new type of loop in JavaScript, and that is the for of loop, and it's used to loop over any type of data that isn't iterable. Now, we're going to learn all about different types of iterables, and we're going to learn about why this for of loop is so useful when we hit things like generators and maps and sets and so on. But for now, we just want to get an idea as to how this loop actually works. Now, what is an iterable? Well, an iterable is anything that can be looped over. So you have an array, you can loop over an array or a string or a map or a set or a generator. We're going to look at all kinds of different examples as to when you can do it. But let's get going with looking at some of the existing loops first and just see like what are the shortcomings of our existing loops and why does for of sort of shine above all of them in a couple of use cases. The first one I want to talk about is I've got this array right here, which is just a regular array with 4 items in it. And we're going to look at the regular for loop. So you probably have written this one over and over. So for let I equals 0, I is less than cuts.length, I plus plus, and then you console log the cuts square bracket I, right? We've done that one many times, and you see chuck, brisket, shank, and short rib. No problem there. What is the downside to something like this? Well, the downside is that it's kind of a confusing syntax. In all of my years of teaching JavaScript, this is probably one that trips people up the most, where it does make sense when you break it down into the 3 parts, but people look at it and sort of get anxious when you see it because there's a whole bunch going on here. And also, it really just doesn't read that nice to me. You don't have like a variable called cut as a singular of cuts. You just have cuts square bracket I, and you have a problem here where if you use a var, you don't have a closure, et cetera, et cetera. So it's good in some cases, but not great because of the syntax that we have here. So I'm going to comment that one out. What other kinds of loops do we have? We have the dot for each array method. So we say cuts dot for each, and that will give us a function. Actually, we use an arrow function there since we don't need this, and that is going to be for each. We're going to give us a cut, console log a cut, and that works pretty well. So what's the downside to that? Well, we cannot abort this loop. We cannot skip one of the ones. So for example, if I wanted to stop once we hit the word brisket, I would say if cut is equal to brisket, then I would break. And then that should console log chuck brisket and then stop the actual loop, right? And then, oh, it doesn't work, right? Because you can't use a break inside of a for each. Same goes for continue. We can't continue. We can't skip over that specific one. It's going to yell at us illegal continue statement. So I like the for each in a couple of use cases, but if you need to be able to skip over it, then that's not a good one. So far we've got these 2 loops, and you sort of have to decide what you want. And then we also have the for in loop. So we're going to learn about for of, but we have for in. So for const, let's say cut in cuts, and console log cut 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. So it actually gives us the index. So you could say like, okay, maybe index and cut. No, that doesn't work. Don't let us do that. Maybe take the const off. No, that doesn't work. So there's no way for us to actually do that either. So I'm going to bring that back. This is actually the index, and we'd have to console log cuts square bracket index. And that will actually give us our value, just like we did on this first one. So that might be okay, but one thing is if you have ever worked with an array where someone has monkeyed with the prototype, and what does that mean here? So you may know that there are many methods on the prototype like dot for each and dot filter and dot map. However, some people believe that you can just add things to the prototype of the array so that if you would like to, like for example, I'm going to go here. I'm going to say the array prototype shuffle. Turn off my ESLint here. It's just yelling at me. ESLint disable. We'll talk about ESLint in a future video. So I've added this shuffle method here, which is kind of cool because you can do things like this. You could take your array here, which is cuts. And we could say cuts.shuffle. Now we have this new shuffle method that was just made because we added it to the prototype of every single array, and that will just shuffle the actual array for us. So that's kind of cool. But now what happens when I console log the index of cuts? Chuck, brisket, shank, short rib function. What happens is that it iterates over absolutely everything in the array, including things that have been added to the prototype. So it doesn't just iterate over the items in the collection, because what are the items of the collection? The items of the collection are chuck, brisket, shank, and short rib, but it also iterates over additional things that have been added. So if someone comes along and says cuts dot shop equals M&M meats, watch this. Now, all of a sudden, anytime you add a property or a method or anything to the array, it's also going to show up in this. So that's kind of a pain. And you may say like, oh, that's fine, but I never do that. But there's lots of times there's libraries that actually modify the prototype. So, for example, MooTools is known for modifying the prototype here. So if I am on a website, I'm not even going to use MooTools here, but I'm going to make an array. This is var names, and I want to iterate over them. So I'd say for name in names, console.log name. Watch what happens. Holy smokes. We get 0 and 1. That's the index. That's going to be the name, actually. But then you get all this other crap. What's this? Well, this is just because the prototype has been modified. And that's what shows up when you use a for in loop. So those three things aside, we now have the for of loop, which sort of gives us the best of all three worlds. And you're able to use the for of loop for absolutely any type of data except objects. We can't use it with objects. We'll look at that in a second. So the way that works is you just say for cut of cuts, console log. And actually, you have to do a const variable here. If you just do that, that's going to leak into the global namespace. So I'm going to say const and cut. And there we go. Even though I've monkeyed with the prototype and added this weird property onto the array, we still only get actual items of it with the for of loop. You're able to use your break and continue. If cut is equal to brisket, then I just want to break. I want to stop the entire loop from going. So we only stop. We should get chuck, brisket, and then the rest should not show because we broke the loop. There we go, chuck and brisket. Similarly, if we wanted to just skip a whole bunch of stuff, so if we wanted to skip console logging brisket, we could just simply say continue. And what that's going to do is it's not going to break the entire loop, but it's going to skip over this one iteration. So we should see chuck, shank, and short rib. Why? Because when it was brisket, we hit continue. And it's sort of like having a return from a function. It just ignores everything underneath it and goes on to the next iteration of our item. So that's introduction to the for of loop. Let's dive in a little bit deeper and see where else we can use it.